Friends, today is Wednesday, the 30th of December. We're back in the cathedral and have just completed our celebration of the Eucharist today, and we see the still signs of Christmas that are with us. This is still the Christmas season. It's the sixth day in the octave of Christmas. And we're coming to the end of the Christmas story in our Gospels these days. Christmas story both from Matthew and from Luke. I've said before that these Christmas stories in Matthew and Luke, though the two stories are very different in Matthew and in Luke, they contain the same themes. And like an overture before an opera, these themes are introduced and developed later in the Gospel. And both evangelists, in the aftermath of the birth of Jesus, hint at the later passion and death. Both of the evangelists, after the birth of Jesus, hint at the later passion and death. Again, all the themes of the life and ministry of Jesus are present in these infancy stories. You might wonder where I get my own background on these stories. Well, every year I read the late Father Raymond Brown, who wrote a number of small books on the Gospels of the liturgical year. And he wrote a small tract called An Adult Christ at Christmas, in which, instead of reading the Christmas narrative as like a children's story, he shows how it much more seriously introduces us to the person of Jesus, his mission, his ministry, and ultimately his suffering and his death. Matthew, in the infancy story, shows a king and chief priests and elders who wish to do away with the child who was born. Remember the story when the Magi come. Herod wants to kill this child and thus orders the killing of the up to 2-year-old boys in Bethlehem. The holy innocents, Jesus, escapes from that, and then the flight into Egypt, a dangerous journey. And thus the child Jesus, even at his birth, had to face opposition. Luke, in the last couple of days, in the scenes of the presentation in the temple with Simeon and Anna, Simeon identifies Jesus as a sign to be contradicted, set for the rise and the fall of many in Israel, words that indicate that opposition and passion and death are on the horizon and evident, even though the child Jesus is still just a child. And thus both evangelists introduce the same passion and death narratives. Again, two gospels that are very different, but both, after the birth of Jesus, introduce this theme of suffering and opposition and passion. Neither Luke or Matthew is satisfied to terminate the nativity on a totally positive and affirmative note, with the acceptance of Jesus on the part of the Magi in Matthew, and the acceptance of Jesus by the shepherds in Luke. They keep going, they keep writing to show that Jesus ultimately, despite initial acceptance in the gospel, will face that opposition. And really, they have to do so, because that is in fact how the gospel was received. Some accepted and some did not. That's the history of the good news. Good news to some, but not good news to others. And the evangelists have already seen the opposition. The evangelists are writing maybe 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So they've already seen in the first century the opposition that is given to the good news. Still, today we end on a peaceful note. Our final gospel of the story is that of Anna the prophetess in the temple. Simeon first and now Anna. Anna the prophetess, and Upon seeing the child in the temple, she gave thanks. She gave thanks, it says, and coming forward at that very time, and that is Anna coming forward and seeing the Christ child, she gave thanks to God about the child to all who were awaiting the redemption of Jerusalem. She gives thanks. And we know, of course, that the word giving thanks is Eucharist, Eucharistia in the Greek, Eucharist. And so we end on a note of thanksgiving of the birth of the Savior. And every time we come together to celebrate the Eucharist, we give thanks for the birth of our Savior, we who are awaiting the redemption of Jerusalem. So we end on a positive note, despite some darkness on the horizon, some positive note as we will celebrate tomorrow, Thursday, the last day of the year. And our gospel is going to be the very beginning of the Gospel of John, and the Word became flesh. Hold that thought, and we'll see you tomorrow.